Hello everyone, this is a revision presentation looking at the evaluation of trade union intervention within both a perfectly competitive labour market and in a monopsony labour market. Throughout this revision presentation or exam booster session, I'm going to specifically look at the arguments for and against a trade union. So this revision video is very much so specific to recapping what is meant by perfectly competitive versus a monopsony labour market, but we're looking more at the idea of preparing for a 25-mark essay question, asking you possibly about arguments for and against trade unions. Are trade unions always desirable or undesirable within labour markets? And looking at the impact that a trade union can have both for employees, employers, and for the government. So we'll be looking at it from the viewpoint of different economic agents. So just as a recap now, I would encourage you to use your work booklets as we go through this, because this information would have been covered with you in class as well. So by definition, trade unions, they bargain with their employers to get the best outcomes for their workers. A trade union is made up of a collective group of workers. So the union itself is made up of members. These members are employees within an organization. And employees work together to bargain with their employers over three specific things. First of all, they look to bargain for improved pay. A collective group of individuals through the trade union will work with their employers to see that their pay grade or their pay in general is a fair amount, that it's in line with inflation, and that it's a standard amount that will allow individual employees to live what we say a full and healthy life. Is the wage rate sufficient for those employees? Is the wage rate a right level depending upon the skill set of the employees? They also fight for better working conditions. And we have seen a huge shift in the work that trade unions have done over the years in making sure that employees do have access to the best working conditions fit for this generation in this day and age. We have come a long way over the years. If we look at Victorian Britain, the Industrial Revolution, for those of you that are interested in history, the way that we manage staff now is very different from how it was in the Victorian times. We no longer have workhouses. We no longer have people simply working for food. Instead, rightly so, we pay much greater attention to things like health and safety within the workplace. Grievances that could happen, workplace bullying, for example, trade unions can step in to make sure that employees are not being exploited by their employer, making sure that employees are being treated fairly, that their human rights are being abided by in the workplace. They also offer better job security. So if, for example, there was fear that a certain industry may lose jobs, that there was fear of possible redundancies, the unions could step in to negotiate with their employer to see, look, is there really any need for those redundancies? Is there anything else that can be done to see that staff are not made unemployed and that structural unemployment doesn't particularly, or voluntary unemployment doesn't particularly arise within an economy. So if you're introducing what a trade union does, there's more to it than just improving its pay. Traditionally, unions would have fought in the earlier stages of union formation. They would have fought simply for improved pay, but over the years, unions have become much more sophisticated. So they look specifically at, if you're introducing this within your first paragraph of your essay, you would talk about how they improve pay, they lead to better working conditions, and they lead to better job security. Trade unions use this phrase called collective bargaining. And collective bargaining, it is the power of a group of individual workers. So if, for example, you've got an organization and there are 50 workers in it, if all 50 of them belong to a union, then it's the power of 50 people. It's the voice of 50 people collectively working together to challenge their employer, to work with their employer, to bargain for, as I said before, higher pay, improved working conditions, and better job security. So trade unions use collective bargaining, where the pay of a large group of workers is determined through one negotiation, thus providing workers more strength and market power. If one worker wanted higher wages, one worker versus their employer is likely to get any further in that they're likely to have very weak market power in negotiating with their employer. However, if you had a team of 50 people fighting for higher wages, the collective group, the voice of the collective group is likely to have greater impact. We often talk about what's called a closed shop agreement with trade unions. Now, an assumption is made that there is a closed shop agreement whereby all workers in a profession are members of one trade union, giving that one trade union maximum market power, where it essentially becomes a monopsony supplier of labour, able to control the labour supply at given rates. Now, you will remember that a monopsony supplier of labour is a situation in which there is only one employer of labour. So if we look, I'm going to give you the example of the teachers' union. So the school that I work in, the main teachers' union is the NSUWT. Now, it's almost a closed shop agreement that if you work in the school, if we want to have any power in a union, that we encourage everyone to be part of the NSUWT. Therefore, if there is an issue in the school, it means that the collective group of individuals through the NSUWT, you've got one trade union representative who can negotiate with the head teacher on behalf of all members of staff in the school who belong to that one trade union. So traditionally now, the governments have stepped in to try and control the power of a closed shop agreement. They encourage slight competition within trade unions because the governments realise themselves the power and the strength of having only one union. So a closed shop agreement is that it's an informal agreement in the organisation that, look, if you work here, you all sign up and you all belong to this particular type of union. We have one trade union rep and everybody is a collective group working with the one union. Closed shop agreement is where the employer and union agree that all workers should be members of a particular union. However, in most sectors, the closed shop is now history. You look at within nursing, within education, within the transport industry, particularly you see a large number of trade unions within the public sector. There is more than one union. So there's more than one teachers union. I have a choice of which union I belong to. And you can choose whichever union you feel would fight better for your rights. Collective bargaining can be done on a national level, i.e. to secure a pay rise for all workers in a particular industry, or a plant level, negotiating for employees at an individual workplace. So we often talk about national level versus plant level. So again, if I was to give you the example of the teachers union, if, for example, the teachers unions across the UK said that, look, all teachers deserve a pay rise, then all unions would work together to collectively bargain with the Department of Education through the government to say, look, you need to pay all teachers in primary and secondary from north, south, the Midlands, everywhere in the UK, regardless of what sector they work in, every teacher that works for the public sector requires higher pay. So that's union intervention on a national level. Trade union intervention on a plant level is when nationally everything is fine, but it could be, for example, there could be a workplace grievance in my individual school. So there are thousands of secondary schools in the UK, but let's say, for example, I had a grievance against one of my colleagues, or I felt that the head teacher or my managers within the school were treating me unfairly. I could approach my trade union and I could disclose to them this one individual case-by-case scenario. I could say, look, I'm happy with my pay. However, I have a grievance against a particular member of staff. I feel that I'm being bullied within the workplace. Not that anybody would bully me, but I feel that I need support from my union to help me in this scenario. So you can look at it both trade union on a national level versus trade union on a plant level. They can make sure that employers comply with laws and regulations over health and safety of workers. Now, this is something we've seen a significant rise in over the years. Gone are the days when simply they would fight for higher wages. Workers have become more tuned in over their employer's right and their employer's duty of care over their employees. And in this day and age, it is only right that when we go to the workplace, that our employer takes their role seriously in making sure that we have a safe place to work, that workplaces are safe and they are healthy organizations. They also look at protecting members from discrimination. And again, I would argue that unions have done a great deal of work around this over the years. You will be as aware as I am over the society changes that we have seen over recent years, and unions quite rightly have stepped in to make sure that employers are doing their bit to make sure that all employees have access to a fair, safe, and a workplace that is free from discrimination. It is not right that any individual should be treated unfairly because of their race, their gender, their religion, the color of their skin. And I'm very grateful for the work that unions do and the work that unions have done in changing the mentality in the workplace. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch over to the visualizer, and we're going to have a look at drawing a diagram for a trade union intervention, or what we call a trade union markup, in a perfectly competitive labour market. So, as I said, we're going to have a look now at a trade union markup in a perfectly competitive market, labour market. Now, what I would encourage you to look at here is that this is the diagram for a markup in general, but we're looking specifically at perfectly competitive labour markets. The diagram for a monopsony is very different. So I would encourage you, once maybe you finish this or before we look at the argument for trade union intervention in a monopsony labour market, that you look at the separate video for the diagram on a monopsony labour market. It is on the YouTube channel. So what we can see here is I've drawn the diagram already simply for supply of labour and demand for labour, which is also equal to marginal revenue productivity, and supply of labour, which is also equal to the average cost of labour. I've drawn this for a perfectly competitive labour market, and it is a very straightforward diagram. Okay, make sure that you label your curves correctly, and you also label the axes. We've got wage rate on the y-axis, a reminder that the wage rate is the price of labour. We've also got the quantity of labour on the x-axis as well. What I've done here, by drawing the supply and demand of labour, I'm showing the equilibrium wage rate in the labour market. Now, this is the equilibrium wage rate that is set by the free labour market forces of labour supply and labour demand. So this is the wage rate without any government intervention through, for example, the national minimum wage, and it's also the wage rate without any trade union intervention. Okay, so you start off your diagram by simply drawing equilibrium wage rate within a labour market. Now, the issue here is that the wage rate that is set by the equilibrium, the free labour market forces of supply and demand, is simply too low. Workers feel that the wage rate of W and Q is too low. It's too low in order for them to live a full and healthy life. It's too low to give them a good standard of living. So what we do, take a ruler, and if we go to wage rate W, we say that trade unions, they engage in a process of collective bargaining. And that collective bargaining aims to increase the wage rate above W1. So let's say, for example, that workers, they all work together, the collective voice of the workplace, they work together and they successfully raise wage rates above wage rate W. And so we have an upward shift here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw the new, what we call the trade union markup. Now, you'll note here that what I've decided to do is this isn't a dashed line. I'm going to call this W1 and then in brackets TU. And that is the new wage rate that's brought about by the union markup. Now, you're probably expecting me to do a straight line straight across like a price cap diagram you might remember from year one as a form of government intervention, or the national minimum wage. What I've done here is, in effect, I've shown a trade union markup where the wage rate is now higher. So wage rates have increased from W up to W1. And this now is the new legal wage rate that the union and the employer has both agreed on. So let's say, for example, the wage rate was originally £8 per hour. The union has said, look, that's not good enough. Workers are demanding at least £10 per hour. So this increase of £2 is your markup. You've increased wages per hour by £2. Both the union, its workers, and the employer is now happy with this wage rate. The employer is now happy to pay this increase in wage. Now, what this does is it creates what we call a kinked supply of labour curve. And that kinked supply of labour curve goes from point A to B up to C. Okay, so I now have this new kinked supply of labour curve. So I'm going to get my red pen, and I'm simply going to show what that new curve looks like. okay? Now, this union markup, the union has been successful. That's great. What it has done, though, is it has increased or it has pushed the market into disequilibrium, and it has now distorted the market. Okay, it was originally in equilibrium, and now we have distorted this market. So I now have Q1 and Q2. I'm going to talk you through this now in a second. So what I'm interested in is these movements along the curve, both for labour supply and labour demand. So if we look at, first of all, I've used A, B, C. I'll look at the original equilibrium as D, and I'll call this E. So if I look, first of all, I'll look at the employee and the impact it has on them. So employees were originally earning £8 per hour at the original equilibrium wage rate. They thought that wage rate was simply too low. The union engaged in collective bargaining and subsequently increased the wage rates up to £10, which is W1. We therefore experienced an extension along the supply curve. So the number of workers willing and able to supply their labour has now increased. There's an extension along that supply curve. So it's increased from Q up to Q2. Workers are willing to work more hours. So if they say, well, before I was working so many hours at £8 per hour, now I could either work the same number of hours, but get £2 more per hour, or if I'm getting £10 per hour, I may be more incentivized, more willing, more motivated to work an extra few hours. So the number of workers willing and able to work has increased, and that's good. There are now more people possibly willing to enter into the labour market. There are now more workers willing to work more hours. That can have significant impacts on the firm in terms of productivity. So that's great. On the flip side of that, though, we now have to look at a different economic agent, i.e. the employer. Now, if we ignore the views of the employee for a second, a reminder that firms demand labour, and labour is a cost of production. Labour is a factor of production, and the wage rate is the cost for that factor of production. So as a result of the increase in wages from £8 up to £2, that's an extra £2 per hour for every employee. So that's going to increase the cost of production for the individual firm. So we experience a contraction along the demand curve. Firms will demand less labour as they are now forced by the union to pay every worker more money or more wages per hour, an extra £2 per hour in this scenario. So as a result, firms demand less labour, and that demand falls from Q1 to Q2. Therefore, we now have a situation where the labour market is in disequilibrium between E and B here. And we say that there is excess supply of labour, also known as a surplus of labour. And that basically means that there is now more individuals willing and able to work than what there are firms willing and able to demand that labour. So firms are only demanding Q1 workers, and that's simply because workers are now more expensive. Firms may switch to possibly more capital intensive methods of production if they find that labour is becoming too expensive, capital being a substitute for labour. However, the number of people willing and able to work has now increased up to Q2. So we've distorted the market. There's now excess supply of labour. There is more people willing and able to work than what there are firms willing and able to demand them. The issue with this, and we'll discuss this later in our evaluation, is that one of the dangers of a union is that it actually creates unemployment. And unemployment occurs from Q to Q1. Now, a reminder that Q was the original number of workers who were in that labour market. Q1 now is the new number of workers who have remained in the labour market. Unemployment is not between Q1 and Q2 because remember, Q2 workers were never employed in the first place. Q2 is the number of workers who would be more than willing now to work, but there are no jobs available for them. So firms now demand at Q1, but workers are willing to work at Q2. So there's excess supply of labour. Unemployment, though, occurs between Q and Q1. Now, the issue with that is that the union, there's winners and losers with the union. The winners are the employees that have kept their jobs, the employees that remain at Q1, that have managed to keep their jobs and now earning £10 per hour. The losers are the number of workers between Q and Q1. Let's say, for example, they lost 8 workers. So they had to make 8 workers redundant because it's now simply too expensive to pay them. So the 8 workers that lost their jobs, they're the losers. Yes, they were willing to work for £10, but they can't because they've been made redundant. The cost of labour has risen. The firm has looked to reduce its cost of production. So the winners are the Q1 workers, the workers that have remained at Q1 that are now earning £10 per hour. The losers, sadly, are those that have lost their jobs, the 8 employees that have lost their jobs simply because it is now too expensive to employ them. Okay, so that should hopefully be a good recap on how you would work that diagram and also how you would explain that diagram within your analysis as well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch back now to the PowerPoint, and we're going to have a look now at the arguments for and against now that we know about this diagram. Okay, so if we look at advantage 1, what is the main advantage of a union? Well, the first and foremost, as we've just looked at, the union brings about an increase in pay for workers. Now, what I've looked at here, I'm going to look first of all at an increase in pay in a perfectly competitive labour market. So just for ease of reference, the diagram that you see to the left-hand side is a diagram that I have just drawn previously when we were looking at what was on the visualizer. So if we start off now with our perfect paragraph, now these are your points versus also lines of analysis, and we'll also then look at some evaluation. So trade unions use collective bargaining to increase wage rates for their members. This is where the pay of a large group of workers, members of the union, are determined through the power of negotiation. More workers equals greater market power over wages. Now, we look at this thing called trade union density. Now, a trade union density looks at the number of workers within the union, and we say that the greater number of workers, the greater the trade union density. The greater the trade union density, the greater the market power they have over wages. In addition to the greater union density, if it could be through a closed shop agreement that we looked at before, where the union almost acts like a monopoly supplier of labour, or monopsony supplier of labour, the sole supplier of labour. So if the union is very powerful, if there's a large number of workers with that union, basically the union has control over the individual employer. If workers are not satisfied with wages at wage rate W and Q, then they engage in collective bargaining to increase their wages above this wage rate. So as I said in the diagram to the left-hand side, workers look at wage rate W, they think it's too low. It's too low because they don't have a good standard of living. They feel that the wage rate does not reflect their marginal revenue productivity. The wage rate is not a true reflection of their human capital, for example. Firms are likely to accept a trade union markup to avoid disruption from strikes and disputes with workers. This would halt or hinder productivity. They may also fear having a negative reputation. So employers are likely to engage with unions in bringing about this trade union markup, because one of the things they don't want, if members do not get their union markup, or if they don't get that increase in pay or improved working conditions, etc., they could potentially go on strike. And strikes cause disruption to productivity. And firms may have to look at, is it now the right time to increase pay? Should pay increase in line with inflation, for example? The union successfully increases wages up to W1 TU. The firm or the employer subsequently becomes a wage taker. So basically the employer or the firm takes the wage rate that is now determined by the negotiation of the trade union. So the trade union can have significant power over the employer. Think about then the wider analysis around an increase in pay. Well, why? What's the impact of that? Why would firms want to pay this higher wage rate? Research has shown that obviously wage rates and wages are the biggest financial motivator for employees. Higher wages may increase motivation of staff, consequently leading to an increase in productivity. So if the firm does agree to the trade union markup, yes, it will increase their costs. But in addition to that, it could lead to increased levels of motivation, and it will lead to increasing levels of productivity. The firm is producing more units of a good with the same number of inputs. So that's all well and good. Everybody loves getting higher wages. But what are some of the things we have to look at? What are some of the things it depends on? What is the unintended consequences? First of all, it depends upon the rate of increase in the union markup. We are making the assumption here that the trade union has been successful. It all depends upon the strength of the union and the union density. We looked at an example that I gave you a few minutes ago, that trade union markup was £2. It went from £10 up to £8. There's a difference there of £2 per hour. What's to say that that £2 isn't enough? What happens if workers turn around and say, well, yeah, we'll take the £2, but we want more. So if you said to workers, yes, we're going to increase your pay by 5 pence per hour, that's likely to have any real impact. If you said to workers, yes, the trade union markup has now increased your wages by £5 per hour or £10 per hour, that is a significant increase in somebody's pay. So it all depends upon the rate of the increase and how successful the union has. Trade union intervention, particularly in a perfectly competitive labour market, causes an increase in unemployment. This is one of your biggest evaluation points within a trade union argument here. The increase in wage rate causes cost of production to rise for the firm. Increases in labour costs as a factor of production. Firms consequently demand less labour. So it's all well and good for the employees and members of the union who are now experiencing higher wages. But in the long run, the firm may have to look at, well, we are now experiencing a rise in the cost of labour. What could be done to bring down the cost of labour? Do we have to make redundancies? Do we have to look at possibly more capital intensive methods of production? Could this possibly lead to cost push inflation? So if the cost of production is rising, firms are experiencing an increase in costs. Could that lead to further rises in the rate of inflation? Is the increase in the wage rate in line with inflation? And is it being caused by cost push inflation? So you really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The increase in wages pushes the labour market into disequilibrium. It distorts the market. Unions distort the efficient competitive labour market outcomes. So originally in our diagram, the labour market was in equilibrium. There was neither an excess supply or excess demand of labour. Now the unions have taken the free labour market forces and have deliberately pushed it into disequilibrium. Governments do not like that because it creates an excess supply of labour. The winners are those who keep their jobs and benefit from increased pay and living standards. However, this is at the cost of unemployment for those that are now made redundant. So you have to balance up. Some will win, but sadly, some will have to pay the price of that increase in costs. And that ultimately is through the cost of unemployment. Please also factor in here as well, and you can add in, we've already looked at a bit of macro here when we looked at cost push inflation, but also think carefully about the idea that unemployment goes against the government's macroeconomic objective of reduced levels of unemployment and high levels of employment. So that's an advantage of an increase in pay in a perfectly competitive labour market. Our advantage too is that trade unions promote more efficient outcomes in a monopsony controlled labour market. So this is now where it starts to get slightly tricky. You will look at that rather daunting diagram to the left-hand side. It isn't as complex as what some of you think. There's a kinked average cost curve of labour, but there also is then a double kinked marginal cost of labour curve there as well. So we're now going to look specifically at a monopsony labour market. Now you'll remember that a monopsony is where there is one employer of labour in a labour market. For example, in education, the NHS, all nurses in the UK that work for the state. So any public sector nurse or doctor will work for the NHS. The police force, for example, they are all a monopsony supplier of labour. So monopsony means that there is one employer of labour. Without the trade union, wages are set below the competitive levels. Now, what we see here is that wage rates are set at Q non. So it's the one to the left-hand side on the bottom of that diagram. So wages are set when MRPL is equal to MCL. So if you look here at point X, okay, wage rates are set below the competitive labour market forces, okay? And in this case, wage rates are significantly below the competitive levels. Employment is determined where MRPL is equal to MCL, where the marginal revenue productivity for labour is equal to the marginal cost of labour. Trade unions can use collective bargaining to raise the wage rates of all members. The power of the trade union means the employer becomes a wage taker. Now, this is significant for the firm. The power of collective bargaining, similar to that of perfect competition, it raises the wage rate. So if you look here, we now increase the wage rate up to W trade. So that's the red kinked new supply of labour curve. The trade union has been successful in raising the wage rate. It brings about collective bargaining, and the firm subsequently becomes a wage taker. Higher wage rates to attract workers beyond wage rates to you will not only increase wages for the newly employed, but also for all existing workers. Hence why marginal cost becomes a double kinked curve. So when you increase the wage rates through trade union intervention, even those members of staff who are not with a trade union, even those members of staff will also experience the same wage increase. So let's say, for example, if I wasn't part of a teachers union and the union did manage to secure a trade union markup for all teachers across the UK, I would still benefit from that. So therefore, the marginal cost of employing one more worker will also increase as well. And that's why we've got that double kink in the marginal cost curve. The monopolist employer will employ where MRPL equals MCL, showing an increase in employment. So because of the new where MRPL is equal to MCL, and that now is a point Y on the diagram. So if you look over, point Y on the diagram, we've now successfully increased wages up to point Y. And as a result, it's now actually profitable for the firm to continue to raise levels of employment. So one of the biggest advantages of trade union intervention in a monopsony is that it increases both the wage rates and also increases employment. Unlike in a perfectly competitive labour market, trade union intervention will increase both the wage rates and employment. Employment is now closer to efficient competitive levels. And the efficient competitive levels would be where S is equal to D, or where the supply is equal to average cost is also equal to MRPL, which is also equal to D. Okay, so I haven't drawn the dashed line here, but you would see it on that diagram. So overall, an advantage of a monopsony, and of course that would bring with it increases in motivation, increases in productivity as well. Certainly, you would increase employment because the increase in the wage rate attracts new workers into the industry. So if you do your research, you'll find that when the government were struggling to recruit nurses and doctors and police officers, one of the things they did through the help of the union was actually increase wage rates. And therefore, workers were incentivized to become teachers, nurses, doctors, because they knew that they were in an industry that now had a much higher wage rate than what it had before, but that wage rate was brought about by the support of a union. So if you look then to the left-hand side in the lilac box now to the left-hand side, some evaluation. Well, that's all well and good. However, what does it depend on? What are the unintended consequences? First of all, it depends upon, again, the rate of increase. How much are we increasing that union markup by? The wage rates are still below that of a competitive labour market. So in a perfectly competitive labour market, the wage rates were above. Whereas in a monopsony, the wage rate is still below that of a competitive labour market. And so even though the union has been successful in raising the wage rates are still not at the competitive level. Because remember, the wage rate would still be higher in a competitive level than what it is with the union markup. Governments have significantly reduced the power of trade unions. So a wage increase may be difficult to secure, and there are reduced numbers in membership. So even though in theory, trade union intervention in a monopsony will increase wages and it will increase employment, due to the regulation and intervention from government, it is actually quite difficult for unions to fight for higher wages in a monopsony labour market, because the government has capped a lot of their ability. And so that even though it's good we have higher wages and higher levels of employment, it's more difficult to bring about that benefit of higher wages and higher employment in a monopsony because unions have capped their power. Okay. We also have seen, because of that cap in power, that union density is actually decreasing. fewer members, certainly within the public sector, are taking up union membership. Unions are less popular than what they were before. Now, the main disadvantage of a union is that in a perfectly competitive labour market, it distorts the market, it causes unemployment. One of the other disadvantages of it is that at one stage, unions were quite powerful, particularly in the 1970s. For those of you that study history and politics, you'll remember Arthur Scargill, for example, the coal miners, very, very militant union intervention there. So regulation is that disadvantage is that regulation has reduced the power of unions over the years. So basically, one of the disadvantages of a union is that they're not as powerful, particularly over wages, as what they were in years past. So union power is reduced due to government regulation, capping the control and power of a trade union over the years. Ever since the 1970s, under a Conservative government, Margaret Thatcher in particular, under her government, under her Conservative government, was very powerful in bringing down the unions. She fought against the coal miners' union. She didn't like the idea of a union running the country. And she did a lot of work to reduce the control and power of unions, particularly with things like being able to call a strike, for example. Regulation, remember, again, jumping into macro, it's used as a supply side policy by government to improve the efficiency of labour, making the economy more competitive and increasing potential output within the economy. So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place here. The union is very good for the employees because it protects the right of employees. But governments understand the power of a union and the power that it can have in halting growth within an economy. And you'll remember from supply side policies that governments have capped the control of unions to stop them from reducing productivity. Things like if they're able to call a strike, that strike will reduce the amount of goods produced, therefore decreasing GDP. If they bring about increases in wages, that's going to lead to rising levels of inflation, and governments must step in to try and cap and control that. Unions can significantly increase the cost for firms, such as markups, longer maternity or paternity leave, longer holidays, and higher health and safety requirements. Governments are keen to support businesses by trying to cap the control of unions. Now, again, this is a tricky one to try and get right here, because governments are well aware of the benefits of higher pay. They're well aware of the importance of making sure that individuals have the right amount of hours and time for maternity and paternity leave. It is good that people have holidays, and it's essential that people are living or working rather in healthy and safe organizations. But all of these things increase the cost for firms. Governments realize that firms are employers. Firms contribute towards productivity in the economy, and therefore they are always very keen to try and work with firms to make sure that their costs are well managed and that unions are not basically dictating to firms what they should do. Higher wages could lead to cost push inflation. So again, that goes against the government's macroeconomic objective of stable prices. The government or the state is also a significant employer. A successful union will increase the cost of wages for the public sector, but they will have to be funded by taxpayers or increased borrowing. Consequently, governments may have to increase taxes. So think about that. The public sector is a major employer within the UK. The UK is an economy that is still heavily supported by a large and very heavily staffed public sector. You look at, for example, there are millions of teachers, millions of nurses and doctors within the UK. The government is our employer. And if the unions, if, for example, the teachers' union secured an increase in pay for all teachers across the country, that would be a significant increase to costs of education. The government would have to find ways of funding that increase in cost. What do? Do we look for higher taxes through fiscal policy? Or do we look at increasing government borrowing, again, through fiscal policy? Regulation over the years has made closed shop agreements illegal, making strike action legal only if a certain percentage of the union workforce agree. So governments have said you can go on strike, but you have to follow a set procedure in order to go on strike. Ideally, we would like any type of dispute or grievance to be settled before strike action is called. However, if a strike is called, so many percentage of the workers have to be actively out on the picket line with their placards protesting their discontent. Due to higher levels of regulation, this has caused trade union density to reduce over the years. So governments have capped the control of unions, and therefore employees have seen that their unions have to work harder than ever before to try and secure some form of movement within the workforce. And as a result of that capped power, union density has actually decreased. Employees are seeing unions as less powerful groups than what they were before. Union density and the threat of strike action are the biggest assets to a union. Therefore, if this is reduced, it will lower the power to increase wages and improve working conditions. Overall, then, our final evaluation, so this follows DISCOM. However, if we look at our evaluation, of this disadvantage, however, it depends upon the degree of regulation. Unions do need to be controlled. What we don't want is militant unions. We don't want militant unions purely out to fight with the government. There has to be a genuine reason there to make sure that they're fighting to protect the rights of workers. They're not simply fighting for the sake of fighting. It also depends upon the degree of union density. The greater the density, the greater the power. And therefore, if you've got greater union density, unions have greater power over challenging the regulations that governments have set. Governments should support the work of unions, fighting to get better non-wage conditions for workers. So if we look at the biggest threat to the government with unions is increased pay, because that leads to inflation. But governments are very keen to work with unions to make sure that employers are providing a good, healthy and safe environment. So things like health and safety regulation and improved working environments to support better staff well-being, subsequently leading to higher rates of productivity. So even though governments are capping the control of unions, they still understand that unions are good for things like productivity. So final conclusion, trade union desirability. Overall, do we like it or do we dislike it? Overall, we would say that trade unions are designed to protect the rights of workers and to prevent them from exploitation of profit-seeking firms. Ultimately, whether you like them or not, we would say that unions are good because they stop the exploitation of workers. Workers can be easily exploited if the employer, remember having the objective of profit maximization, the employer can easily exploit their workers. It depends upon the impact of the trade union. It depends upon the strength and power, the trade union density. So as I've said several times before now in this revision presentation, the higher the union density, i.e. the number of members, the greater the power of the union to bargain collectively and increase wages or improve working conditions. It may be more difficult for employees in industries with a weaker density. So if there is a weaker density, the power of the union is much less than maybe what it would have been before. It also depends upon the rate of the trade union markup. It depends upon the type of labour market, i.e. perfectly competitive or labour market versus a monopsony. So we would say that labour market intervention in a perfectly competitive labour market causes an increase in wage, but it also brings about a reduced levels of employment. Whereas in a monopsony labour market, it can increase pay and increase employment. So we would argue that it depends upon the rate of the union markup, but also depends upon which labour market you're looking at it. We would say that unions are better in a monopsony, but they have greater unintended consequences in a perfectly competitive labour market. It also depends upon the state of the economy. Trade unions are more likely to be successful when the economy is in a period of growth and strength. Trade unions become less powerful when the economy is in, for example, a recession. So when the economy is in a recession, what you will find is that union members are more likely to accept the wage rate because they're grateful to have a job. and they realize themselves that if we push our employer too hard, we may lose our job. So I'm grateful to have a job, therefore I'm not going to fight with the employer. Short run versus the long run. In the short run, trade unions can increase wages and working conditions for workers. However, in the long run, they can cause unemployment, going against the government macroeconomic objective, particularly in a perfectly competitive labour market where they make those redundancies due to the higher cost of production, and subsequently, as a result, may seek more capital-intensive methods of production. The cost, unemployment and reduced productivity, the strikes. In the long run, this can increase cost for the firm, causing them to be less profitable. Some may shut down or look for capital-intensive methods of production. We could lose out on things like GDP, for example, and become less competitive in the eyes of other countries. Our recommendation, ultimately, what we're going to finish up with. We believe that unions are good, but they do require regulation to control their power. Too powerful of a union can have very negative effects. Militant unions need to stop. Unions that are fighting for the genuine reasons to get the best for the workers is good, but militant unions, we need to try and control the militants of those unions. We would recommend that the union and the employer and the government, I should have added in there, union, employer and government work together. Okay, so that is your ultimate recommendation, that all economic agents should work together to secure the best outcomes. Hopefully you find that revision presentation useful. Like I said, use your A3 revision mind map. Please do go over your work booklets as well. I hope that was a good overview of union intervention within both perfectly competitive and monopsony labour markets. Best of luck with your exams and your essays.